April 5th, 1242. Lake Peipus. 500 peasants about to face elite Teutonic knights clad in armor. This should have been a massacre. It wasn't. This isn't just another medieval clash. It's the battle where a 22-year-old prince turned ice into a weapon, where peasants defeated Europe's most feared military machine, where nature itself was forged into a battlefield. The story you are about to witness changed the relationship between Russia and Europe forever. And it all started with an idea that no military doctrine had ever taught. But to understand how 500 peasants became the doom of elite cavalry, you first need to understand what they were fighting against. In the 1200s, the Teutonic Knights marched through Eastern Europe like an unstoppable force of iron. They weren't just soldiers, they were an institution. Each knight wore nearly 90 pounds of shaped metal. When this armored mass charged at a gallop, the sound alone, the thunder of hooves, the roar of steel was enough to break armies before impact even occurred. This wasn't just protection, it was psychological warfare. Entire armies broke before contact was even made. That's what heavy cavalry did. It wasn't just about killing enemies, it was about destroying the will to fight before the fight began. And the Teutonic Knights had perfected this art like no one else. They had been pushing east for decades, conquering, converting, building stone fortresses that made their conquests permanent. Every city that fell became a base for the next invasion. Every victory fed the reputation that made them invincible. By 1242, they had pushed deep into the territory of Novgorod, a prosperous republic, a trade hub. One of the last significant defenses against Teutonic expansion to the east. If Novgorod fell, there would be nothing between the knights and the heart of the Russian lands. But there was a problem. Novgorod didn't have an army capable of facing the knights in the open field. Not in conventional combat, not by the rulebook. The defenders of Novgorod numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 men. A mix of professional soldiers and militias, townspeople with improvised weapons, rural peasants who had never faced elite troops, common men being asked to hold the line against Europe's deadliest cavalry. The math was brutal. Teutonic knights on armored horses versus peasant militias. Full-plate armor against leather and wood. Centuries of training against farmers holding spears for the first time in their lives. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution waiting to happen. Worse still, Novgorod was geographically exposed. Vast open plains. Perfect terrain for cavalry. The knights could maneuver freely. Flank, encircle. Use every advantage their mobile superiority provided. Fighting defensively in fortifications might work for a while, but eventually supplies would run out. Reinforcements would never arrive. The Teutonic Order had time, resources, patience. Conventional defense would just be a slow death instead of a quick one. And every commander in Novgorod knew it. They needed something beyond courage, beyond numbers. Something that rewrote the very rules of engagement. They needed a leader who thought differently, who saw what military doctrine would never teach. They needed Alexander Nevsky. In 1242, Alexander Nevsky was only 22 years old. But he already carried a reputation that made older commanders pay attention. 2 years earlier, he had defeated Swedish invaders on the Neva River. A quick, brutal, decisive battle. Not just winning, but winning in a way that the Swedes would never try again. That victory earned him the name, Nevsky, from the river where he had broken an army that thought it was marching to an easy conquest. But it wasn't the victory itself that set him apart. It was how he fought. Alexander didn't follow tactical playbooks. He rewrote them. Where other commanders saw terrain, Alexander saw weapons. Where others saw disadvantages, he saw opportunities. His brain worked in battle geometries others didn't even consider. And now, facing the Livonian Order, he needed that unconventional thinking more than ever. The knights were coming. Their intentions were clear. Novgorod would be taken, converted, or destroyed. Alexander had weeks, maybe days, to find a way to stop a force no one had ever stopped before. Command meetings were frantic. Older commanders advocated strengthening urban fortifications, stocking supplies for a prolonged siege, sending messengers begging for reinforcements that might never arrive. Survival tactics, not victory tactics. Alexander listened to everything. Then he did the one thing no experienced general would recommend. He marched his army out of the city, away from the fortifications, straight into the heart of the knight's territory, not to retreat, to position himself. On a battlefield he would choose, on terrain that made no sense at all for cavalry combat, on a lake, frozen, in the middle of spring, Lake Peipus. The commanders thought he was insane. Spring ice? When the thaw had begun? When the surface was weakening every day the sun shone? Placing thousands of men on dubious ice wasn't strategy. It was suicide. But Alexander saw what no one else saw: physics. It was early April. The spring sun melted the top layer of the lake by day, and it refroze at night, creating a surface as smooth as glass. Treacherous for a peasant on foot spreading their weight. Manageable. But for 300 pounds of horse and rider concentrated on 4 iron hooves, catastrophic. Without traction, there is no momentum. Without momentum, the world's most feared cavalry becomes nothing but dead weight sliding on the ice. But Alexander knew that reconnaissance alone wouldn't win the battle. The knights weren't fools. They wouldn't simply charge into an obvious trap. He needed to make them want to charge. He needed to turn their confidence into bait, their institutional arrogance into a weapon against themselves. And for that, he needed psychology. For years, the Teutonic Knights had won every pitched battle. Every time enemies dared to face them in open terrain, they were crushed. Each victory reinforced the belief: no force can withstand our charge. That confidence was their strength. But it was also their vulnerability. Confidence makes you predictable. It makes you underestimate opponents. It makes you believe that the rules that have always worked will always work. And Alexander Nevsky was about to prove that those rules could be broken. The trap was being prepared. Smaller forces positioned as bait. The frozen lake waiting. Spring turning solid ice into a treacherous surface. All that remained was to make the deadliest elite cavalry in Europe believe that this would be just another easy victory. To make them charge. But Nevsky had an idea that no military doctrine taught. A tactic that would turn ice into a weapon of war. A strategy that would make nature fight alongside peasants against knights. The frozen lake wasn't just a battlefield. It was about to become a death trap. How do you turn ice into a lethal trap? Nevsky's plan required 3 elements: terrain, psychology, and perfect timing. Here is what he saw that the knights didn't. What Nevsky understood that his enemies didn't was basic physics and psychology. Heavy cavalry dominated medieval battlefields for a reason. It wasn't just armor. It wasn't just trained warhorses. It was momentum. A half-ton armored knight on a warhorse moving at nearly 20 miles per hour creates a devastating impact force. You don't block that charge. You don't resist it. You are crushed by it. But momentum requires one thing: a stable surface. Solid ground allows horses to accelerate. It allows knights to maintain formation. It allows for the wedge charge that made the Teutonic Knights invincible. Remove the stable surface, and you no longer have heavy cavalry. You have slow, armor-clad targets that cannot maneuver. And that was exactly what the spring ice offered. Early April on Lake Peipus, the ice was still intact but transformed by the rising temperature. The top layer melting during the day, refreezing at night, creating a surface like glass, smooth, slippery, treacherous under every step. For soldiers on foot, manageable. You move slowly. You distribute your weight. You keep your feet under you. 300 soldiers spread across a wide area don't create enough concentrated pressure to destabilize the ice. For cavalry in a charge formation, catastrophic. A warhorse weighs about 100 pounds. A knight in full armor adds another 260 pounds. Lance, shield, gear, another 45 pounds. Over 400 pounds concentrated on 4 hooves. Multiply that by 200 knights charging in close formation. You no longer have weight distribution. You have a deadly concentration of mass on a treacherous surface. Hooves slip. Horses lose their balance. Formations collapse. The very thing that made the knights invincible, their heavy armor and armored horses, turns into dead weight, pulling them down. Nevsky saw this, but seeing the trap and getting the knights to walk into it were 2 completely different problems. The Teutonic Knights were no fools. They had conquered entire territories because they knew how to assess a battlefield. They understood terrain. They recognized ambushes. They wouldn't simply charge into an obvious trap, unless they didn't know it was a trap. Alexander needed to make this battle look like an opportunity, not a threat. He needed to turn their institutional arrogance into a weapon against themselves. And arrogance was something the knights had in abundance. For a decade, the Livonian Order had won every pitched engagement against Russian forces. Every time enemies dared to face them in open terrain, they were crushed. It didn't matter if the Russians had superior numbers. It didn't matter if they had favorable terrain. The heavy cavalry charge shattered enemy lines like a hammer smashing glass. This winning streak created psychological certainty, an absolute belief in the invincibility of the cavalry charge. And certainty makes you predictable. When you win the same way repeatedly, you stop questioning whether that way will work again. You assume it always will. You develop a blindness to alternatives, to exceptions, to situations where the old rules no longer apply. Nevsky was about to exploit that blindness. His plan required three elements working in perfect sync: terrain, bait, and timing. First, the terrain. Nevsky positioned his main forces, 3,000 to 4,000 defenders, professional soldiers, and urban and rural militia from Novgorod on the ice of Lake Peipus. Not on the banks, not on solid ground where the knights would expect a traditional defensive formation, right on the ice. To any commander following conventional military doctrine, this looked like suicide. You don't place your army on unstable ice. You don't remove the option to retreat to solid ground. You don't handicap your mobility. But Nevsky wasn't following conventional doctrine. He was creating new doctrine. The composition of his forces mattered. Peasant militiamen, both urban and rural, formed an integral part of the defending army. They weren't a separate force. They were an essential component of the strategy. Men who knew icy terrain. Men who understood how to move on treacherous surfaces because they did it every winter. Men whose lighter equipment and minimal armor transformed into an advantage on terrain where weight was a curse. Novgorod's professional soldiers provided discipline and combat experience. The militia provided numbers and knowledge of the terrain. Together, they created a defensive force perfectly adapted to the battlefield Nevsky had chosen. Second element: bait. Nevsky detached small contingents and positioned them where they would be seen. To the knights, this was irresistible. Russian forces exposed in open terrain without fortifications, committing a grotesque tactical error. It looked like a gift. They didn't see the trap. They saw only the chance to crush the enemy with a single devastating charge, exactly as they had done dozens of times before. Nevsky was betting everything on their arrogance. Third element: timing. Early April. The exact period when spring ice was strong enough to support weight, but too slippery to allow traction. Too early in spring, and the ice would be too solid. Horses would still have mobility. Too late, and the ice would start to crack. No one could fight on it. Nevsky chose the precise moment when the ice was the perfect weapon. Intact, so there was no risk of mass drowning that would make battle impossible. But the upper surface transformed into a slick and treacherous layer that would destroy any attempt at a coordinated cavalry charge. This wasn't the popular myth about ice breaking and knights drowning. Primary sources don't support that dramatized version. The ice didn't break, it didn't need to break. What happened was subtler and more devastating. The slippery surface negated the only advantage that made heavy cavalry unbeatable: momentum, speed, coordinated formation, impact force. Everything depended on horses maintaining traction and riders maintaining control. Remove the traction, and horses can't accelerate. They can't turn quickly. They can't keep a tight formation. Knights can't use lances effectively because they can't stabilize their horses. Shields become dead weight because just staying balanced consumes all their attention. And so the deadliest elite cavalry in Europe transforms into a group of heavily armed men, trying not to fall while lightly armed opponents surround them on terrain they master. But Nevsky knew that reconnaissance and preparation alone didn't guarantee victory. The most brilliant plan fails if the enemy doesn't cooperate. He needed to make the knights want to charge. He needed to transform their tactical decision into a psychological inevitability. So he used the bait. Russian forces positioned visibly on the ice. Not retreating, not fortifying, just waiting, demonstrating apparent tactical incompetence. To the knights, this confirmed everything their previous victories had taught them. Russians don't understand modern warfare. Russians don't know how to counter heavy cavalry. Russians make the same mistakes repeatedly. The sight of vulnerable enemy formations in open terrain triggered a pattern that had worked dozens of times before. Charge. Break enemy lines. Turn the battle into a rout. The decision to charge wasn't a strategic gamble. To the knights, it was a logical conclusion based on past experience. Every instinct trained through years of war said this was the perfect opportunity. And that was exactly what Nevsky needed them to think. The trap was set. 3,000 to 4,000 Novgorod defenders, professional soldiers and militia perfectly integrated, positioned on terrain that turned the enemy's advantage into a fatal disadvantage. Smaller forces acting as bait, visible enough to draw attention. The spring ice, calculated to the precise day, waiting to negate all the cavalry doctrine that made the Teutonic Knights invincible. Now came the hardest part. Waiting. Nevsky couldn't force the battle. He couldn't attack first and reveal his position. He needed the knights to do exactly what he expected. Charge in full formation. Commit all their heavy cavalry in a massive attack. Any hesitation would ruin the plan. If the knights retreated to evaluate the terrain, if they sent only reconnaissance units first, if they questioned why Russian forces were positioned so strangely, the trap would fail. But Nevsky understood the psychology of victory. He knew that commanders accustomed to dominating don't stop to question when they see obvious enemy weakness. They attack, immediately, decisively, because waiting allows opportunity to escape, and certainty built on past victories suppresses caution. It makes you believe that rules that have always worked will always work. It blinds you to the moment when the exception appears. The Teutonic Knights were about to discover that rules can change, that terrain can become a weapon, that past victories do not guarantee future success. But not yet. Not yet. First, they needed to see the bait. They needed to make the decision. They needed to charge. On April 5, 1242, under a gray spring sky, forces of the Livonian Order approached Lake Peipus, knights in full armor, armored war horses, lance after lance of heavy cavalry that had broken armies on battlefields across the Baltic region. They saw the Russian forces positioned on the ice. They saw what looked like a grotesque tactical error, a perfect opportunity. Exactly what Nevsky had planned. The trap was set. Now came the hardest part. Convincing Europe's most confident military elite to charge onto terrain that would turn their every advantage into a fatal disadvantage. To make momentum become a curse. To make heavy armor become an anchor. To make institutional confidence become lethal blindness. The battle on the ice would last hours, but the decisive moment would come in the first charge. When an unstoppable force met an immovable tactic. When elite cavalry discovered that terrain can matter more than armor. When peasants and professional soldiers fighting together on terrain they understood proved that innovation beats technological superiority. But first, the knights needed to make the decision Alexander Nevsky had prepared for them. The decision that seemed logical, inevitable, obvious. The decision to charge, and they charged. Lance after lance, Europe's deadliest cavalry advanced. The wedge formation, perfect, accelerating for impact. But the moment the hooves touched the ice at full speed, reality struck. No, the ice didn't break. Forget the myth of knights sinking into the water. What happened was tactically much crueler. The ice bore the weight, but refused traction. The surface was slippery, treacherous, unstable under pressure. Horse hooves that should have found solid traction for a charge formation found a surface that gave slightly. That shifted. That prevented coordinated movement. That turned every step into a gamble on whether the next would maintain balance or cause a fall. Horses began to slip, not falling through the ice, but skating sideways, losing formation, breaking the wedge. Knights trying to maintain control discovered that the heavy armor providing protection on the battlefield became a massive disadvantage on unstable terrain. Every movement to correct balance pulled the center of gravity out of alignment. Every attempt to turn or accelerate risked a complete fall. And once a knight in full armor falls on ice, getting up becomes almost impossible. 130 to 175 pounds of armor distributed across the body. No traction under hands or knees. Every attempt to push up simply slips out, like a turtle flipped on its back. Helpless, vulnerable, exposed. The Russian forces waited. They let the ice do the work. They let physics turn elite cavalry into stumbling targets. They let the charge's momentum dissipate into a chaos of skating horses and knights struggling to keep their balance. Then they attacked. Not against a coordinated cavalry formation, but against opponents already committed, already off balance, already fighting just to stay standing. Militia fighters who had spent entire lives walking on frozen ice, who knew instinctively how to distribute weight, how to move without slipping, how to keep balance on an unstable surface. They faced knights who had never trained for this terrain, who never considered that the surface beneath them could become a decisive factor, who never planned for a scenario where their greatest tactical advantage, armored heavy cavalry, became a liability. The battle lasted hours, but the decisive moment came in the first charge, when an unstoppable force met immovable terrain, when technological superiority discovered that tactical innovation matters more than equipment, when a military elite accustomed to dominating learned that confidence built on past victories does not guarantee future success. The Teutonic Knights fought with courage. They were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were professionals trying to execute tactics that had been validated through decades of victories. But they were fighting on terrain that Alexander Nevsky had turned into a weapon. And no amount of heavy armor or cavalry training could overcome the basic physics of slippery ice under a mild spring. When the battle ended, the knights retreated. Not destroyed, but decisively defeated. The advance to the east stopped. The expansion of the Livonian order found its limit. Not through superior force, not through overwhelming numbers, but through a 22-year-old commander who understood that terrain can be more powerful than an army. Alexander Nevsky didn't invent psychological warfare. He didn't invent terrain exploitation. He didn't invent bait and ambush tactics. But he combined these elements with a deep understanding of physics, psychology, and the institutional limitations of his enemy. He saw what the Teutonic Knights couldn't see, that the very tactics that made them invincible on normal battlefields made them vulnerable on terrain that negated their fundamental advantages. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare. You don't fight on the enemy's terrain. You don't accept the enemy's rules. You don't try to win by playing their game better than they do. You change the game. You redefine the battlefield. You turn your apparent weaknesses into advantages and their strengths into liabilities. 500 peasants didn't turn a frozen river into a death trap, but 3,000 to 4,000 professional soldiers and urban and rural militiamen, fighting together under a commander who understood how to weaponize the terrain, achieved an unlikely victory against elite cavalry. And the distinction matters, because the real story is more impressive than the myth. It wasn't about magic numbers or individual heroism. It was about a system. It was about preparation. It was about understanding the rules that govern combat and finding the point where those rules shift. It was about recognizing that technological advantage only works when conditions allow it to be applied. And it was about having the courage to bet everything on a plan that seemed insane right up until the moment it worked. The battle on the ice became a pivotal moment in Russian history. It established Alexander Nevsky as a legendary commander. It provided early validation of asymmetric warfare principles that still inform military strategy today. And it demonstrated a truth that commanders have relearned repeatedly throughout history. Innovation beats numbers. Understanding terrain beats superior equipment. Smart tactics beat rigid doctrine. These principles still apply today. Asymmetric warfare isn't about being weaker. It's about being smarter. It's understanding the system so well that you find where it breaks. Alexander Nevsky didn't try to fight on the enemy's terms. He changed the terrain. He turned their greatest strength, their weight and impact, into their greatest weakness. The ice melted centuries ago, but the lesson remains. When the odds are against you, don't attack brute force. Change the game. If you want more analyses on how intelligence beats force, subscribe to the channel. Until next time.